David and Goliath is one of the best-known stories in the Bible. But the story did not end when Goliath fell. Years later, another warrior appears in Scripture, Lahmi, the brother of Goliath. And the man who killed him was not David. His name was Elhanan. But that simple answer opens a much bigger problem, because another biblical passage seems to say that Elhanan killed Goliath himself. So who did Elhanan really kill, and why does this ancient puzzle still matter in the biblical tradition preserved in Ethiopia?
Welcome to the 81 Scrolls.
To understand why the name Elhanan creates such a problem, we first need to return to the part of the story that seems certain. Long before Lahmi appears, 1 Samuel brings us to the valley of Elah, where Israel and the Philistines are facing one another across the battlefield. From the Philistine camp comes a champion named Goliath from the city of Gath. That detail, Gath, is easy to pass over. But remember it, because it will become increasingly important as this story unfolds. Goliath challenges Israel to send out a man to fight him. The confrontation that follows has become so familiar that David and Goliath is now shorthand for almost any contest between the seemingly weak and the overwhelmingly powerful. But the biblical account is more specific than the expression we use today. David approaches without the conventional weapons Goliath expects. He takes stones from the stream and carries the sling he already knows how to use. When the two men move toward one another, David sends a stone from the sling into Goliath's forehead, and the Philistine falls face down. David then takes Goliath's own sword and uses it against him. When the Philistines realize that their champion is dead, they flee. Within 1 Samuel 17, there is no uncertainty about the central point of the story. David defeats Goliath. And if we stopped reading there would seem to be little reason to ask who killed him. But biblical history does not stop at the valley of Elah. The death of 1 Philistine champion did not end the conflict between Israel and the Philistines. Much later, when David is no longer the young man standing before Goliath, the narrative returns to warfare between the same peoples. 2 Samuel explicitly tells us that war broke out again between the Philistines and Israel. David is now fighting alongside experienced warriors, and at one point he becomes exhausted enough that another Philistine warrior threatens his life. And this is where the familiar story begins to enter much less familiar territory. Because the closing chapters of Samuel introduce a succession of remarkable Philistine warriors, men associated once again with Gath, the same city from which Goliath had come. Among them are Ishbi-Benob, Saph, and a man described as having 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. Goliath, it turns out, was not the last formidable warrior connected with Gath to confront the men of Israel. And buried inside this later series of battles is the name that will lead us directly to Goliath's brother and to the mystery at the center of our story. The name we are looking for appears inside a short collection of battles near the end of 2 Samuel. And the first thing we notice is how different David's position has become. This is no longer the young shepherd walking alone toward Goliath. In 2 Samuel 21, David goes into battle with his men against the Philistines, and this time the text tells us that David becomes exhausted. One of the Philistine warriors, Ishbi-Benob, sees an opportunity to kill him. Before that can happen, Abishai, son of Zeruiah, comes to David's aid, strikes the Philistine, and kills him. It is a brief scene, but it reverses something familiar. Years of conflict have changed the picture. David is no longer standing alone while everyone else watches. Now, the men around him are the ones stepping forward, and Ishbi-Benob is only the beginning. The next battle takes place at Gob. There, Sibbecai the Hushathite kills Saph, whom the Hebrew text associates with Rapha. English translations handle that expression in different ways, often with language such as descendants of the giant or descendants of Rapha. What matters for our story is that Samuel presents Saph as part of the same small group of formidable Philistine warriors described at the end of the chapter. Then the text moves to another battle, and a new Israelite warrior enters the story. His name is Elhanan. For the moment, hold on to that name. We will come back to him because this seemingly minor figure will soon create the central problem of our investigation. But Samuel is not finished. Another battle takes place at Gath, the city we were careful to remember from the story of Goliath. Here the text describes an unnamed man of unusual stature. The detail it preserves is remarkably specific. He has 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 digits in all. When he taunts Israel, Jonathan, the son of David's brother Shimea, kills him. Samuel then closes this sequence by bringing the pieces together. These 4 warriors, the text says, were associated with Rapha in Gath, and they fell by the hand of David and by the hands of his servants. That final reference to Gath matters. Goliath had come from Gath. Now, long after his famous confrontation with David, biblical tradition preserves another cluster of dangerous Philistine warriors connected with the same city. Yet the text does not tell us to imagine a single family of supernatural monsters, and it does not identify every one of these men as a Nephilim. Those conclusions would take us beyond what Samuel actually says. What Samuel does give us is a pattern. One battle follows another. Ishbi-Benob faces David and is killed by Abishai. Saph falls to Sibbecai. The unnamed warrior from Gath falls to Jonathan. And in the middle of these accounts stands Elhanan. His battle is described in only a single verse. But that single verse contains a familiar name, Goliath the Gittite. In the Masoretic Hebrew text of 2 Samuel 21:19, Elhanan appears to be the man who struck him down. That is difficult to reconcile with the story we just left in 1 Samuel 17, where David defeats Goliath. But before we try to solve that problem, there is another biblical account we need to read. The book of Chronicles preserves a parallel version of these battles. Sibbecai appears again, Elhanan appears again, Gath appears again. But this time, one crucial word becomes a name. And suddenly, Goliath has a brother. That brings us to Chronicles. The sequence is immediately familiar. Once again, Israel is fighting the Philistines. Sibbecai appears again. Gath appears again, and so does Elhanan. But when we reach 1 Chronicles 20-5, the wording is different in one crucial way. Chronicles says that Elhanan, son of Jair, killed Lahmi, the brother of Goliath the Gittite. It also gives Lahmi the same memorable weapon detail. Found in the parallel passage, the shaft of his spear was compared to a weaver's beam. For the first time in this investigation, Goliath's brother has a name, Lahmi. And that allows us to answer the question in our title more directly than we could from Samuel alone. According to Chronicles, the man who killed Goliath's brother was Elhanan. That part of the passage is straightforward. What the text does not give us is a biography of Lahmi. It does not tell us whether he was older or younger than Goliath. It does not describe his personality. It does not tell us how he reacted to Goliath's death or whether the two brothers ever fought together. Chronicles gives us only a few firm details. Lahmi was identified as Goliath's brother. He fought in another conflict with the Philistines, and Elhanan killed him. Even the wording brother of Goliath matters because it keeps us close to what the Hebrew text actually says, rather than building a larger family story around two names. And there is another detail worth noticing. Chronicles does not isolate Lahmi from the other battles we just examined. His death comes immediately after Sibbecai kills Sippai, and immediately before another battle at Gath involving the man with 24 fingers and toes. The chapter closes by associating these warriors with Rapha in Gath and saying that they fell by the hand of David and his servants. So Lahmi belongs to the same wider sequence of Philistine conflicts that Samuel preserves. The difference is that Chronicles makes his identity much clearer. And that clarity is exactly what creates the next problem. Because if Chronicles says Elhanan killed Lahmi, the brother of Goliath, why does the parallel verse in 2 Samuel 21:19 say that Elhanan killed Goliath the Gittite? The two passages are close enough that scholars have long compared them word by word. Even the Hebrew forms surrounding Lahmi, Bethlehemite, and brother of, have been examined because some of those words are visually similar and may help explain how the two versions developed. But the history is not simple enough to reduce to a single certain answer. Before we examine that textual problem, however, there is one person we need to understand more clearly: Elhanan. He has now appeared in both Samuel and Chronicles. And depending on which verse we are reading, he seems to have killed two very different men. That is where the story becomes more complicated and where we need to go next. That brings us back to the man whose name appears at the center of both accounts: Elhanan. Chronicles gives us a clear statement: Elhanan, son of Jair, killed Lahmi, the brother of Goliath. But beyond that single battle, the Bible tells us surprisingly little about him. There is no extended story of his life, no description of his appearance, and no speech placed in his mouth. Still, Elhanan may not be entirely unknown elsewhere in the biblical record. Near the end of 2 Samuel, a list of David's elite warriors includes Elhanan, son of Dodo of Bethlehem. The parallel list in 1 Chronicles 11:26 preserves essentially the same identification: Elhanan, son of Dodo, from Bethlehem. That connection is important because the Elhanan of 2 Samuel 21:19 is also associated with Bethlehem in the Hebrew text. There he is called Elhanan, son of Jair or Regim, the Bethlehemite. For that reason, some scholars consider it quite likely that the warrior in the list of David's mighty men and the Elhanan who fought the Philistine champion are the same person. But likely is the careful word here. The passages do not stop to explain the relationship for us, and the names of Elhanan's father are not preserved in exactly the same form. In one place, we have Dodo. In another, Jair or Regim. And in Chronicles' account of the battle, simply Jair. Those differences are not something we should smooth over. In fact, they become part of the textual problem itself. The unusual form Jair or Regim in 2 Samuel 21:19 has attracted particular attention because the Hebrew element Oregim means weavers, and the same word appears again at the end of the verse, where the Philistine warrior's spear shaft is compared to a weaver's beam. Textual scholars have therefore considered the possibility that part of the expression may have entered Elhanan's family name through a copying problem. That does not give us permission to rewrite the verse however we please. It simply shows why scholars compare this passage so carefully with its parallel in Chronicles and with other references to Elhanan. And another comparison makes the case even more interesting. In both 2 Samuel 23:24 and 1 Chronicles 11:26, Elhanan is associated with Bethlehem. That matters because 2 Samuel 21:19 also calls Elhanan a Bethlehemite, while 1 Chronicles 20:5 does not. Instead, at roughly the same point in the sentence, Chronicles gives us the name Lahmi. In Hebrew, those forms are close enough in appearance that scholars have asked whether the history of one reading may somehow be connected with the other. The issue becomes even more complicated when the phrase "brother of Goliath" in Chronicles is compared with the wording of Samuel. For the moment, however, one conclusion is enough. Elhanan should not be treated as a mysterious stranger invented for a single verse. The biblical texts place a man by that name among the warriors associated with David, and there is a reasonable scholarly case that these references concern the same fighting man. What we cannot reconstruct is a detailed biography that the sources never give us. We do not know what Elhanan thought before battle. We do not know whether he had ever met Goliath. And we certainly do not have a biblical account of a personal feud between Elhanan and Goliath's family. What we do have is more interesting than a story we might invent. We have an Israelite warrior whose name survives in several passages and whose greatest recorded victory changes depending on which biblical account we place in front of us. In Chronicles, Elhanan kills Lahmi, the brother of Goliath. But in the surviving Masoretic Hebrew text of 2 Samuel 21:19, the sentence appears to say that Elhanan killed Goliath the Gittite himself. And now the problem can no longer be avoided. David has already killed Goliath in 1 Samuel 17. So why does Samuel seem to give that same victory to Elhanan? To understand what may have happened, we need to place the two verses side by side and look closely at the few Hebrew words that separate Goliath from Goliath's brother. Now we can place the two accounts beside each other. And this is where the problem surrounding Elhanan becomes impossible to miss. In 1 Chronicles 20-5, the sequence is clear. Israel is again at war with the Philistines, and Elhanan, son of Jair, kills Lahmi, the brother of Goliath the Gittite. The verse then describes Lahmi's spear shaft as being like a weaver's beam. But when we turn back to the Masoretic Hebrew text of 2 Samuel 21:19, we find a remarkably similar sentence. There is another battle with the Philistines. Elhanan appears again. The opponent is again connected with Gath. The spear shaft is again compared to a weaver's beam. Yet one crucial detail is different. In the Hebrew text of Samuel as it has come down to us, Elhanan, son of Jair or the Bethlehemite, strikes down Goliath the Gittite. Lahmi is not named, and the words brother of are not there. That creates an obvious question. We have already read 1 Samuel 17. In that account, David confronts Goliath, strikes him with a stone from his sling, and Goliath dies. So how can another passage appear to give the same victory to Elhanan? Before trying to answer, there is something important to understand about the English Bible you may have in front of you. Not every English translation presents 2 Samuel 21:19 inches exactly the same way. The English Standard Version, for example, follows the Masoretic Hebrew closely here and says that Elhanan struck down Goliath the Gittite. The New American Standard Bible likewise has Elhanan killing Goliath. But other familiar translations read differently. The New International Version says Elhanan killed the brother of Goliath. The New King James Version does the same. These renderings bring Samuel into line with the clearer wording found in 1 Chronicles 20-5. And readers of the King James Version may have encountered that wording for centuries. Elhanan slew the brother of Goliath. So two people sitting beside each other with different English Bibles could read this verse and come away with different impressions. That does not mean one translator simply forgot the story of David and Goliath. It means translators have had to make a decision about a genuine textual difficulty. The Hebrew text underlying the traditional Masoretic form of Samuel contains Goliath without the explicit phrase brother of. Chronicles, by contrast, contains both the name Lahmi and the expression brother of Goliath. Scholars therefore have to ask whether Chronicles preserves wording that was lost or altered in Samuel, whether Chronicles itself reshaped an earlier version, or whether both passages developed from an earlier form that can no longer be recovered with complete certainty. And the differences are not random. Look again at the two verses. Samuel has Jair or regime. Chronicles has Jair. Samuel describes Elhanan as the Bethlehemite. Chronicles places the name Lahmi in the corresponding part of the sentence. Samuel has a Hebrew direct object marker before Goliath. Chronicles has the expression brother of Goliath. and both verses end with virtually the same memorable image. The Philistine warrior's spear shaft was like a weaver's beam. Those similarities are exactly why textual scholars compare the passages so closely. The question is not simply whether Samuel and Chronicles happen to mention two unrelated battles. The wording is too closely connected for that to be the most natural place to begin. Instead, we appear to be looking at two forms of a related account forms that agree on Elhanan, the Philistine conflict, Goliath of Gath, and the distinctive spear description, while differing at precisely the point that determines who Elhanan actually killed. And that distinction matters. If Chronicles preserves the better reading here, then Elhanan killed Goliath's brother, while David's victory over Goliath remains exactly where 1 Samuel 17 places it. But some scholars have proposed a different history. Perhaps the Samuel wording is earlier, and Chronicles later reshaped the account in a way that brought it into harmony with the David and Goliath story. Others have suggested that neither surviving form preserves every word of an earlier version perfectly. At this point, we should resist the temptation to choose whichever explanation feels most comfortable. The evidence deserves a closer look. Because a handful of Hebrew words, including Lahmi, Bethlehemite, brother of, and even the repeated word for weaver, may help us understand how two passages that are so similar came to tell us something so different. And that brings us to the next question. Did a copying error change the story, or are Samuel and Chronicles preserving two different stages of an older tradition? That is where textual criticism becomes essential. At this point, the question is no longer simply who Elhanan killed. The harder question is how two closely related passages came to preserve such different answers. This is where textual criticism becomes useful. The term can sound technical, but the basic idea is straightforward. Biblical books were copied by hand for centuries before printing existed. When scholars compare surviving manuscripts, ancient translations, and parallel passages, they sometimes find differences. Their task is not to choose the reading they prefer. It is to ask which reading best explains how the others may have developed. And 2 Samuel 21:19 is exactly the kind of passage where that work matters. The first clue is Elhanan's father. Samuel calls him the son of Jair. Chronicles has the shorter form, Jair. The ending oregim means weavers, and the same Hebrew word appears again later in the very same verse when the Philistine spear shaft is compared to a weaver's beam. That repetition has led textual critics to suspect that part of the phrase may have entered Elhanan's name during the copying process. Caspar Zozolins, whose detailed study of the verse appeared in Vetus Testamentum, treats this as part of a larger pattern of textual difficulty in the sentence. But the father's name is only the beginning. The more difficult problem involves two expressions that we encountered in the previous section. Samuel describes Elhanan as the Bethlehemite. Chronicles, at approximately the corresponding point, gives the name Lahmi. In Hebrew, those forms are strikingly close. The form connected with Bethlehemite contains Lahmi, while Chronicles has Lahmi as the apparent name of the Philistine warrior. That similarity has led scholars to ask whether one form arose from a scribal misunderstanding of the other. Then comes an even smaller difference, only a few Hebrew letters, but with major consequences. In Chronicles, the text contains the expression, brother of Goliath. In Samuel, the corresponding wording contains instead the ordinary Hebrew marker used before a direct object. Those two Hebrew forms also resemble one another visually. So, a copyist working with an ancient manuscript would have been dealing with several similar-looking words clustered inside a very short sentence. That makes accidental textual change possible. But possible is not the same as proven. And this is where the scholarly debate begins. One approach has argued that Chronicles preserves the clearer or earlier sense of the episode, Elhanan killed a brother of Goliath, while the wording of Samuel became damaged somewhere in transmission. This reading has the advantage of fitting naturally with 1 Samuel 17, where David kills Goliath. Tyndale House notes that this has long been one of the major explanations offered for the passage. A different approach moves in the opposite direction. Some scholars have argued that Samuel may preserve an older tradition in which Elhanan was associated with the death of Goliath, and that Chronicles later changed or harmonized the passage because the famous account in 1 Samuel already identified David as Goliath's killer. A study of David and Goliath traditions, published in a collection on ancient textual transmission, explicitly presents Chronicles as attempting to resolve the tension created by Samuel. That interpretation has an important consequence. If it were correct, Lahmi, the brother of Goliath, would not necessarily preserve the earliest form of the story. It could reflect a later effort to make two traditions fit together. But there is also a third possibility. The surviving form of neither verse may preserve every element of an earlier wording exactly as it once stood. Ozolins has proposed a text-critical reconstruction in which Elhanan was indeed a Bethlehemite, but the apparent personal name, Lahmi, may itself have arisen through scribal confusion. In that reconstruction, Elhanan could originally have killed an unnamed brother of Goliath rather than a man originally named Lahmi. It is a carefully argued proposal, but it remains a reconstruction, not something the surviving manuscripts allow us to demonstrate beyond doubt. That distinction matters for our story. We can say with confidence what the surviving texts now read. The Masoretic text of Samuel gives Elhanan Goliath as his opponent. Chronicles gives him Lahmi, the brother of Goliath. What we cannot do with the same confidence is reconstruct every stage between the earliest form of the account and the versions that eventually reached us. And perhaps that is the most important lesson here. Textual criticism does not always hand us one clean answer. Sometimes it narrows the possibilities. Sometimes it shows how a change could have happened. And sometimes it tells us that the evidence is not strong enough to choose one reconstruction with certainty. In this case, the safest conclusion is also the most interesting one. The relationship between Samuel and Chronicles is real, the textual difficulty is real, and the exact history behind that difference remains debated. But Hebrew is only one part of the evidence. These books did not survive in Hebrew alone. They were translated and transmitted in other ancient languages, especially Greek, and centuries later within the Christian world of Ethiopia, in Ge'ez. Those traditions give us additional witnesses to the long life of this passage. And before we ask what the Ethiopian Bible contributes to the mystery, we first need to see whether the ancient Greek version makes the problem any easier. That is where we turn next. That question brings us beyond the Hebrew text. If the wording of 2 Samuel 21:19 changed somewhere during transmission, then an obvious next step is to ask what happens in an older translation of Samuel. For that, we turn to the Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures. In the Greek tradition, the books we call 1 and 2 Samuel are usually known as 1st and 2nd Kingdoms. And when we reach the verse corresponding to 2 Samuel 21:19, something important happens. The Greek text does not solve the problem by inserting Goliath's brother. Instead, it preserves essentially the same difficult reading found in the Masoretic Hebrew text. Elhanan, identified as the son of Ariogim and as a Bethlehemite, is said to strike down Goliath the Gittite. The familiar description of the spear shaft as being like a weaver's beam follows immediately afterward. That matters. It tells us that the wording in which Elhanan kills Goliath is not simply something we can dismiss as a peculiarity found only in the later medieval Hebrew manuscripts represented by the Masoretic tradition. A Greek textual tradition also knew this form of the sentence. That does not prove that it was the original wording of the story. Ancient translations have their own histories, and the books of Samuel in particular preserve a complicated textual tradition, but it does tell us that the problem is old. The reading linking Elhanan directly with Goliath had already entered an ancient stream of the biblical text. And then we turn to Chronicles. Here the Greek evidence moves in the other direction. The Septuagint form of 1 Chronicles 20-5 names Lahmi rendered in Greek as Lahmi and explicitly describes him as the brother of Goliath the Gittite. Elhanan, son of Jair, is the man who kills him. The verse then gives the same description of the spear shaft that we have seen before. So the Greek versions preserve the same basic contrast we have been following in Hebrew. In Samuel, Elhanan kills Goliath. In Chronicles, Elhanan kills Lahmi, Goliath's brother. And that is significant because the Septuagint does not simply step in and provide a neat solution. It preserves the difficulty. For viewers accustomed to thinking of the Hebrew Bible and the Greek Bible as two single, perfectly uniform columns that can simply be compared line by line, this is worth slowing down for a moment. Ancient biblical transmission was rarely that simple. There was no single printed edition sitting on a desk in Jerusalem, Alexandria, Rome, and Ethiopia. Biblical books circulated in handwritten copies. Greek translations themselves developed textual histories. Different books could preserve different relationships to the Hebrew forms from which they were translated. So when we compare Samuel and Chronicles in Greek, we are not looking at a later translator who noticed the problem and quietly corrected it. At least, in the standard Septuagint texts preserved for these verses, the distinction remains. Samuel still points toward Goliath. Chronicles still points toward Goliath's brother, and that gives us an important boundary for what we can say. The Greek evidence does not allow us to announce, Chronicles is definitely original. Nor does it allow us to conclude, Samuel must preserve the original story. What it shows more safely is that both forms of the tradition have deep roots in the history of the biblical text. One form places Elhanan opposite Goliath. The other places him opposite Goliath's brother. That is exactly why scholars have continued to debate how these passages are related rather than treating the issue as an obvious copying mistake with an obvious solution. There is another reason this matters for our story. When most modern readers encounter this problem, they are working with an English Bible printed only a few years or perhaps a few decades ago. It can be easy to imagine that the question began with modern translators. It did not. The tension reaches far behind modern English versions. Behind them stand Hebrew manuscripts and traditions. Beside them stand ancient Greek witnesses. And beyond those lie other Christian traditions that received, translated, copied, and preserved these same biblical books. One of those traditions developed in a place far removed from the ancient battlefields of Israel and Philistia, Ethiopia. Christian scripture was translated into Ge'ez, the classical language of Ethiopia, very early in the history of Ethiopian Christianity. Ephraim Isaac, writing in The New Cambridge History of the Bible, places the completion of the translation of the scriptures into Ge'ez in early Christian times, around the middle of the 4th century, while also emphasizing the importance of Ethiopic literature for studying the transmission of biblical texts. That gives the Ethiopian tradition a genuine place in this investigation. Not because Ethiopia possesses a secret chapter explaining what happened to Goliath's brother, and not because a Ge'ez manuscript automatically settles a question that Hebrew and Greek leave open. Its importance is more grounded than that. For centuries, Ethiopian Christians copied, read, and preserved Samuel and Chronicles within their own biblical tradition. Ge'ez therefore belongs to the wider family of ancient witnesses scholars can consider when studying how biblical texts traveled through languages and communities. And this brings us directly to the question raised by our title. We have seen what the Hebrew text says. We have seen that the Greek tradition does not simply erase the difficulty. So what, exactly, does the Ethiopian Bible contribute? Does its tradition preserve a different account of Lahmi? Does it provide an ancient solution to the Elhanan problem? Or is its real significance something very different? To answer that carefully, we now have to leave Samuel and Chronicles in Hebrew and Greek for a moment and enter the world of the Jair Bible. That brings us to Ethiopia. And this is where we need to be especially careful, because the phrase Ethiopian Bible can easily create the wrong expectation. We are not looking for a lost Ethiopian chapter in which Lahmi receives a longer story. We are not looking for a different ending to the battle. And there is no reliable evidence that an Ethiopian manuscript suddenly tells us in greater detail why Lahmi fought or gives Elhanan a different biography. What Ethiopia gives us is something less dramatic, but historically much more useful. It gives us another long-standing biblical tradition through which Samuel and Chronicles were copied, read, and preserved. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church's own list of biblical books includes 1st and 2nd Samuel as well as 1st and 2nd Chronicles. The same list also reflects the broader Ethiopian canon for which the tradition is well known, but the books involved in our present mystery are not unusual Ethiopian additions. They are Samuel and Chronicles themselves. That distinction matters. The story of Lahmi is not found in Enoch. It is not found in Jubilees. It is sitting in 1 Chronicles 20, just as it is in Bibles used far beyond Ethiopia. What makes the Ethiopian evidence interesting is the language in which these biblical books were transmitted. For centuries, Ethiopian Christians read scripture in Jebez, the classical literary and liturgical language of Ethiopia. Scholarly work on the Ethiopic Old Testament places the translation of biblical books into Jez within the late antique Christian period, while also showing that the history of individual books and later revisions can be complicated. Michael Nibb's work on the Ethiopic Old Testament, for example, emphasizes that these texts must be studied through their relationship to Greek, Hebrew, Syriac, Arabic, and the manuscript history within Ethiopia itself. That means the Jair's Bible is valuable not because it automatically preserves the oldest reading every time. No ancient version works that way. A translation can preserve an early reading in one verse, a later development in another, and evidence of revision somewhere else. The value comes from comparison. And we know that Samuel was genuinely part of this Ethiopic textual tradition, not simply from modern church lists, but from surviving scholarship and critical editions. In the 19th century, August Dillman published a critical edition of the Ethiopic books, traditionally called the Books of Reigns, which include 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. His edition was prepared from Ethiopic manuscript evidence and supplied a critical apparatus. The same larger Ethiopic Old Testament project also included Paralipomenon, the traditional title for Chronicles. These editions remain important witnesses to the history of Ethiopic biblical scholarship. So the Jez's evidence is real. But what does it do for the particular question before us? Here, we need to separate what can be demonstrated from what we might wish the evidence would tell us. The material we have examined does not support the claim that the Ethiopian biblical tradition contains a separate account in which Lahmi's identity, motives, or death are described in greater detail than they are in Chronicles. Nor does the available evidence give us grounds to say, the Ethiopian Bible settles the Elhanan problem once and for all. That would go beyond what the textual evidence allows. The question surrounding 2 Samuel 21:19 remains a problem that has to be studied across textual traditions, not solved by assigning automatic authority to one version simply because it is ancient. And that is actually where the Ethiopian tradition becomes most useful. It reminds us that the Bible did not move through history along a single straight line. Samuel and Chronicles were read in Hebrew-speaking and Greek-speaking worlds. They moved into other Christian languages. They entered Ethiopia. They were copied into Jezzy's manuscripts. And over many centuries, communities preserved these books within their own liturgical and scholarly traditions. When modern textual critics compare those witnesses, they are not trying to discover a secret Bible behind the familiar one. They are trying to understand the history of the text we already have. That difference is important, because an ancient manuscript tradition does not have to reveal a hidden story in order to matter. Sometimes its value lies simply in preserving another witness to how a verse was understood and transmitted. And Samuel is particularly suited to that kind of investigation because its textual history is unusually complex. Comparing Hebrew, Greek, and other ancient versions can sometimes help scholars recognize where readings diverged, even when those witnesses do not give us enough evidence to reconstruct the earliest wording with certainty. So, when we ask what the Ethiopian Bible contributes to the story of Goliath's brother, the most responsible answer is this. It places the question inside a much wider history of biblical transmission. Lahmi was not discovered in Ethiopia. Elhanan was not recovered from a forgotten Ethiopian book. And no evidence we have examined gives Ethiopia a unique lost account of the battle. Instead, the Gezez tradition stands alongside other ancient biblical traditions as evidence that these books continued to live, travel, and be copied far beyond the world in which their stories were first written. That may sound less dramatic than a lost chapter, but it tells us something more meaningful. The verse about Goliath's brother survived because generations of readers in very different cultures considered these books worth preserving. And Ethiopia became one of those cultures. There is, however, one reason the Ethiopian setting can lead us toward another question. The Ethiopian Orthodox biblical tradition also preserves books such as 1 Enoch, where traditions about the Watchers, their offspring, and ancient giants play a major role. For anyone familiar with those texts, the temptation is obvious. Goliath was enormous. Lahmi belonged to the same wider cluster of warriors associated with Gath and Rapha, and Ethiopia preserved Enoch. So does that mean Goliath and his brother were somehow descendants of the Nephilim? It is an understandable question, but the answer cannot come from resemblance alone. To know whether Lahmi should really be connected with the Nephilim, we have to return once again to the words the biblical texts actually use. The Ethiopian tradition brings one more question into view. Because Ethiopia preserves 1 Enoch, and because 1 Enoch contains the famous story of the Watchers and their giant offspring, readers naturally wonder whether the warriors connected with Gath, Goliath, Lahmi, and the others belong to that same tradition. It is an understandable connection to make. But the biblical texts do not let us make it automatically. The word Nephilim appears most famously in Genesis 6-4, where they are associated with the difficult story of the sons of God and the daughters of men. The term appears again in Numbers 13:33, where the spies report seeing the Nephilim and connect the Anakites with them. That language is important. But it is not the language 1 Chronicles 20 uses for Lahmi. When Chronicles names Lahmi, it simply identifies him as the brother of Goliath the Gittite. It does not call him a Nephilim. It does not mention the Watchers. It does not trace his ancestry back to Genesis 6. The surrounding passage does use another term. In 1 Chronicles 20-4, Sippai is associated with the sons of Rapha. In verse 6, the unusually large man from Gath is said to have been born to Rapha. And verse 8 closes the sequence by saying that these men were born to Rapha in Gath. That is why many English Bibles use words such as giant or descendants of the giants in this passage. But the Hebrew term behind that language is related to Rapha, Rephaim, not the word Nephilim. And those are not simply interchangeable labels. Elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, the Rephaim are associated with peoples remembered for extraordinary size and strength. Deuteronomy, for example, describes the Emim as a people great, numerous, and tall, compares them with the Anakim, and says they were counted among the Rephaim. King Og of Bashan is likewise described as one of the remaining Rephaim. So, there are genuine connections among several biblical traditions about unusually formidable peoples. But connection is not the same as identity. Numbers 13 does connect the Anakim with the Nephilim in the report of the spies. Deuteronomy compares the Anakim with groups counted as Rephaim. Those passages show that biblical traditions about ancient peoples, extraordinary stature, and legendary strength can overlap. What they do not give us is a simple family tree that runs Nephilim, Rephaim, Goliath, Lahmi. The texts never lay out that genealogy. And that distinction becomes even more important once one Enoch enters the conversation. In the Book of the Watchers, the giant offspring of the Watchers belong to a much older primeval story, one set before the flood. That tradition expands Genesis 6 inches, a very different literary setting. It is one of the reasons the word giants carries so much weight in later Jewish and Christian imagination. But Lahmi appears in an entirely different context. He is a Philistine warrior. He is connected with Gath. He is identified as Goliath's brother, and he is killed during one of the later wars with Israel. There is no verse in Chronicles that connects him with the Watchers. There is no statement that he descended from the giant offspring described in Enoch. And there is no reason to import that genealogy into the text simply because Ethiopia preserved both Chronicles and one Enoch. That would confuse two different questions. One question is, what traditions did Ethiopian Christianity preserve? The answer includes both Chronicles and Enoch. A very different question is, does Chronicles identify Lahmi as one of Enoch's giants? The answer is no, at least not explicitly. This does not mean the relationship among Nephilim, Anakim, Rephaim, and later giant traditions is unimportant. It is a real subject of biblical scholarship, and the Hebrew Bible itself sometimes places these groups in overlapping conceptual territory. Recent scholarship on the Rephaim, for example, continues to examine how biblical memories of unusually powerful ancient peoples developed alongside wider West Semitic traditions. But for this story, restraint gives us the clearer picture. We do not need to turn Lahmi into a descendant of fallen angels to make him interesting. The text already gives us enough. He belonged to the world of Gath. He was remembered as Goliath's brother. He stood within a sequence of formidable Philistine warriors, and Chronicles says that Elhanan killed him. That brings us back to where our investigation began, not to a hidden lineage, not to a lost chapter, but to one short verse and one surprisingly complicated question. We began by asking, who killed Goliath's brother? At this point, we have enough evidence to answer that question clearly. We also have enough evidence to say what we still cannot know. And that distinction between what the text tells us and what later imagination adds is exactly where this story should end. So after following the story through Samuel, Chronicles, ancient textual traditions, and the Ethiopian biblical world, we can finally answer the question we began with. According to 1 Chronicles 20-5, Goliath's brother was Lahmi, and the man who killed him was Elhanan, son of Jair. That much is clear in Chronicles. What makes the story complicated is what happens when we turn back to Samuel. In the Masoretic text of 2 Samuel 21:19, Elhanan appears to kill Goliath the Gittite himself, the same Goliath whom 1 Samuel 17 says was defeated by David. That difference has been examined for generations because the two passages are too closely related to ignore. Their wording overlaps, their setting overlaps. Elhanan appears in both, Goliath appears in both. Even the description of the spear shaft being like a weaver's beam appears in both, yet the identity of the man Elhanan kills is different. Some scholars believe Samuel suffered a textual disturbance during transmission and that Chronicles preserves the clearer form of the account. Others have argued that Samuel may reflect an earlier tradition and that Chronicles later reshaped the passage to bring it into harmony with the story of David and Goliath. Still others have proposed that both surviving forms may reflect changes from an earlier wording that we can no longer reconstruct with complete certainty. And that is where the evidence requires us to stop. We can describe the problem. We can compare the texts. We can see how certain Hebrew words may have contributed to the difference. But we cannot recover every stage of the verse's history with absolute confidence. The Ethiopian biblical tradition does not give us a secret ending to this story. It does not introduce another account in which Lahmi returns for revenge, and it does not provide a hidden genealogy connecting Goliath's family directly to the Nephilim. What it does provide is something historically important. Samuel and Chronicles were preserved within the Jez's biblical tradition of Ethiopia, alongside a broader collection of sacred writings. That tradition reminds us that these books did not survive through one language, one manuscript, or one Christian community. They traveled, they were copied, they were translated, and they were preserved across centuries by communities separated by enormous distances. That wider history does not make the text less meaningful. It helps us understand how remarkable its survival really is. And perhaps that is the most interesting part of Lahmi's story. He was not hidden in a forbidden book. His name was not removed from Western Christianity. He was there in Chronicles all along. Most readers simply pass over him because his entire story occupies only a few words. But those few words lead us into a much larger question about Goliath, Elhanan, David, ancient manuscripts, and the long history of the biblical text. So, if we ask one final time, who killed Goliath's brother? Chronicles gives us the answer. Elhanan killed Lahmi. But if we ask exactly how the parallel account in Samuel came to read differently, the most responsible answer is more cautious. The evidence does not allow us to say with certainty, and sometimes that is where serious biblical study becomes most valuable. Not when every question receives an easy answer, but when we learn to recognize the difference between what the text actually says, what the evidence allows us to reconstruct, and what later imagination has added to the story. Goliath may be the name everyone remembers, but his brother leaves us with a question that reaches far beyond one battlefield. It reaches into the history of the Bible itself. If you enjoy exploring the Ethiopian Bible, ancient manuscripts, and biblical stories that are often passed over too quickly, subscribe to the 81 Scrolls and join us for the next journey. And I'd like to hear your view in the comments. When you compare Samuel and Chronicles, which explanation of the Elhanan passage do you find most convincing and why? Keep the discussion respectful, stay close to the evidence, and if this video gave you a new perspective on a familiar biblical story, consider sharing it with someone who might enjoy the same investigation. There are still many passages waiting to be read more carefully, and sometimes one forgotten verse is enough to open an entire world